Hello again, and welcome to The Truth About Psychiatry. This is episode number 8 on The Truth About Psychiatry. Um, in this episode, we will talk about schizophrenia. The title of this episode is after Thomas Szasz' book, Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry. So, just in review, let me share with you what our previous videos have been about. Video 1, we talked about the truth about psychiatry and Cracked, this red book over here. And 2 was the truth about psychiatry, the secret of NIM, where we began to discuss Mad in America, this black book here. And number 3, the truth about psychiatry, anatomy of an epidemic, this book here, right, this one. And number 4 was Psychiatry Under the Influence, another book by Robert Whitaker. Number 5, we discussed the myth of mental illness, Thomas Szasz, his book. Number 6, we discussed Szasz, Burstow, and anti-psychiatry. And 7, we talked about psychiatry, celebrities, and SSRI stories. So, in this episode, I'd like to discuss Thomas Szasz's book, Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry. And I have a blog post on my Psychiatric Survivors blog. Again, that's psychiatricsurvivors.wordpress.com. And the title of this blog post is Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry. So in this blog post I have several quotations that I've pulled straight from Szasz's book, and I'd like to go through some of these. Also, we'll reference an interview that Thomas Szasz did with William Buckley, who was one of the founders of National Review, eminent scholar and conservative thinker. And Buckley did an interview with Thomas Szasz on his program Firing Line, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Then after we've talked about Szasz on those in that book and in that interview, I would like to introduce you to a cartoonist who actually is an anti-psychiatrist who creates cartoons, anti-psychiatry cartoons. So that will be pretty much it for today. So let me just jump right in. By this point, it should be obvious to anyone who has read this blog or who has watched these videos that bipolar disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and every other disorder listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders are completely fictitious diseases. It should also be obvious to anyone who has read this blog or watched these videos that the symptoms associated with these false diagnoses are very real and extremely painful. While they are real and painful, the alleged psychiatric remedies for these problems actually cause the very problems that they're purported to cure. And I often write this in my blogs, just when I've read what I think is Thomas Szasz' best book, I find another and discover that it is also his best book, and I would say that's the same is true of this book, Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry. So as I've explained in other videos, psychiatry is bunk. And one of the reasons is that mental illness itself is a myth. There's really, even though people experience a wide variety of symptoms of suffering, whether you call it depression, whether you call it mood swings, whatever you want to call it, people go through difficult life problems. No one is denying that. Um, but the concept of mental illness itself is just, it's false, and there's no such thing as an actual mental illness. There's no thing there, but it's a myth that's so it's been enraciné. It's so ingrained in our society that people take it to be the truth. Um, but what Szasz helps us understand is not just the myth of mental illness, but that in this myth of mental illness, schizophrenia is the sacred symbol of psychiatry. So I mean, if you forget about every other fictitious disease, whether ADHD, whether bipolar, MDD, all of these fake diagnoses that are in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, if you just look at schizophrenia, that is sort of the pillar, or as Szasz calls it, the sacred symbol of psychiatry. And in this book, Szasz demonstrates why this sacred symbol, or this pillar, really amounts to nothing. And just to be clear, this is not to say, and if there are people watching this who have relatives, or even if you've experienced or been labeled as schizophrenic, that this is not to deny that whatever symptoms you've felt or things that you've gone through aren't real. This is just to show you that the creation or the invention of this fake disease is problematic, because even though it puts a label on what some people think that they're experiencing, the history behind it will reveal that the people who created the label weren't describing an actual observable phenomenon or biological reality. They were inventing a label to fix on what they perceived as undesirable behavior. So, and Szasz is very clear about distinguishing, real illness from these fake or invented illnesses. Real illnesses being illnesses that can be observed and diagnosed and treated. Fake illnesses being those that are, they're invented rather than diagnosed. Szasz's thesis is bold, it's shocking, and it makes perfect sense. In brief, Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry, in this book, Szasz argues that psychiatry is fake medicine that helps fake physicians, psychiatrists, to influence or control fake patients, the mentally ill. Moreover, Szasz asserts that schizophrenia is a fake disease that fake physicians or psychiatrists have often used to justify and to conceal their misdeeds. Szasz's thesis might sound absurd to anyone who has encountered schizophrenia in real life, but he begins with a simple Socratic question that ought to be asked. What is schizophrenia? So Szasz is great because he's very Socratic, he's very childlike, he's very meek. He's asking the question, what is mental illness? What is schizophrenia? And these are questions that sometimes are dismissed, or they're not asked out of fear or for whatever reason. It's taboo in our society. It might sound absurd, but what is schizophrenia? Thomas Szasz asks, what does the term schizophrenia mean? It is a simple question, but the answer may surprise you as it surprised me. It turns out that schizophrenia is a word and an idea that was invented by a Swiss psychiatrist and eugenicist named Eugen Bleuler. So eugenicists being people who believe that there are superior orders of a human being, and ways of eliminating the inferior human beings uh, should be done, and it's claimed that this is um, you know that there are ways of measuring human beings that are superior and those who are inferior. That was a poor definition of eugenics, but look it up, and there's a lot of many connections between eugenics and, of course, the National Socialist movement in Germany, Nazism. The claim that's okay, and then Szasz says the claim that some people have a disease called schizophrenia and that some presumably do not was not based on any medical discovery, but only on medical authority. That it was, in other words, a result not of empirical or scientific work, but of ethical and political decision making. Consider the implications of the foregoing claim. If Szasz is right, if schizophrenia is a fake disease, then the entire enterprise of psychiatry is the most elaborate hoax that has ever been perpetrated upon the unsuspecting human race. How did it happen? Szasz traces the invention of schizophrenia back to a couple of major figures, namely Eugen Bleuler, the Swiss psychiatrist and eugenicist, and Emil Kraepelin. Quote, "It must be noted, therefore, that Kraepelin and Bleuler discovered no histopathological lesions or pathophysiological processes in their patients. Instead, they acted as if they had discovered such lesions or processes, named their patients accordingly, and committed themselves and their followers to the goal of establishing a precise identification of the organic nature and cause of the diseases. In other words, Kraepelin and Bleuler did not discover the diseases for which they are famous, they invented them." So, gotta hand it to these guys. They're very creative at coming up with names for supposed diseases, and very persuasive and influential in convincing so many people that these so-called mental illnesses actually correspond with reality, or that they were able to convince people that these supposed mental illnesses are illnesses like any other, which is simply not true. Szasz continues, his fame, Bleuler's fame, rests on having invented new disease, and through it, a new justification for regarding the psychiatrist as a physician, the schizophrenic as a patient, and the prison where the former confines the latter as a hospital. Thus the question, what is schizophrenia, was never answered with any shred of evidence by the psychiatrist who coined the term and invented the fake disease. So Szasz utterly demolishes Bleuler, Kraepelin, and Freud's every pretense to scientific certainty, and he demonstrates that schizophrenia plays a ceremonial role in the false religion of psychiatry. Szasz shows that the fathers of psychiatry were not physicians, but conquistadors and colonizers of the mind of man. Quote, their society wanted them, Bleuler and Kraepelin, to extend the boundaries of medicine over morals and law, and they did so. It wanted them to extend the boundaries of illness from the body to behavior, and they did so. It wanted them to disguise conflict as psychopathology and confinement as psychiatric therapy, and they did so. So, let's see, in these paragraphs here, what stands out to me is, again, Szasz is showing, he says, a new justification for regarding the psychiatrist as physician. So one of the reasons why Bleuler and Kraepelin, Freud, Charcot, all of these fraudulent, quacks, these psychiatrists, were aiming at legitimizing the field of psychiatry as medicine. So they wanted to influence psychiatry, move it closer to. They wanted credibility as real doctors, and these were ways of of increasing their prestige and their power by claiming that they are real doctors that treated these real diseases. But as Szasz shows us, they were not. They're fake doctors treating fake diseases from fake patients. So, um, so schizophrenia became the justification for the involuntary confinement of those whose behavior a relative, with the assistance of a psychiatrist, found objectionable, odd, or obnoxious. Psychiatry became the perfect tool for depriving patients of their liberty. As Szasz indicates, psychiatry continues to rationalize confinement as hospitalization and brutality and torture as treatment. It is not enough, Szasz declares, to murmur that psychiatric coercion is bad. It is necessary systematically to condemn it and eschew it. And Szasz was very adamant about not only condemning and eschewing psychiatry, but about having at least what he would call coercive psychiatry, having that abolished. If we are shocked to discover that the origin of schizophrenia, it would be well for us to consider that Bleuler also coined the term autism. So that will be a subject for a future video, but I'd just like to introduce it now. This book called Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna by Edith Schaeffer. We will probably do a whole video on autism because, as we've seen, Bleuler coined the term autism and he also coined the term schizophrenia. And the more we learn about Bleuler and the invention of these fake diseases and how they spread, the more skepticism we ought to have toward anything that is called schizophrenia or autism today. And I'll share some of that history to help you understand why really it's such an awful thing that these fake diseases were ever invented in the first place. So what are the implications for understanding the true origins of terms such as schizophrenia and autism? Szasz explains. What then would happen to psychiatry if medicine and law, people and politicians recognize the metaphoric and mythological character of mental illness? Such demythologizing of psychiatry would undermine and destroy psychiatry as a medical specialty, just as surely as the demythologizing of the Eucharist would undermine and destroy Roman Catholicism as a religion. Although I object to Szasz's unsavory treatment of respectable religion, his depiction of psychiatry as a pseudo-religious movement is right on target. The gist of my argument, Szasz continues, is that men like Kraepelin, Bleuler, and Freud were not what they claimed or seemed to be, namely physicians or medical investigators. They were, in fact, religious political leaders and conquerors. Instead of discovering new diseases, they extended through psychiatry the imagery, vocabulary, jurisdiction, and hence the territory of medicine to what were not and are not diseases in the original Virchovian sense. That is, disease as defined by Virchow, Virchow, meaning an actual biological, measurable lesion or pathology. So that's a little bit about Szasz's critique of schizophrenia, his critique of Kraepelin, Bleuler, and Freud. This book, The Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry, was published about 60 years after Freud and Bleuler and Kraepelin began pathologizing behavior. And at the time of its publication, there were no facts about what schizophrenia actually was or what caused it. Even after 4 decades since the publication of Schizophrenia, The Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry, in 1976, there are still no clear answers to these questions other than the answers that Szasz gives in his book. Nevertheless, psychiatry has promoted the use of the term schizophrenia to such an extent that is found as necessary to make up definitions in order to regulate the public discussion of schizophrenia. In the chapters that follow, the analysis of the history of psychiatry, Szasz debunks the false claims of R.D. Laing, David Cooper, and others who dubbed themselves leaders of the early anti-psychiatry movement. And we talked about why Szasz opposed that early form of so-called anti-psychiatry. Szasz then considers whether schizophrenia is a psychiatric syndrome or a scientific scandal, and he gives persuasive evidence to support the latter of these two options. With his penchant for parables, Szasz goes on to compare psychiatry to a perversion of matrimony, and he describes schizophrenia as a sacred symbol of psychiatry. But Szasz issues what is perhaps his clearest condemnation of schizophrenia as a fake disease in the following terms. Quote, "Since schizophrenia is not a descriptive but a dispositive term, since it does not explain what is wrong with the alleged patient but justifies what his psychiatrist does to him, it is, in my opinion, simply pointless to continue to treat the term as if it were the name of a disease whose biological character is exactly like that of any other so-called organic disease. Nevertheless, according to the official medical, psychiatric, legal, scientific view, the proposition that schizophrenia is a disease is now a foregone conclusion. Hence, the loyal psychiatrist's task is not to speculate about whether schizophrenia is a disease, but to develop methods for its more accurate diagnosis and more effective treatment. The discovery of lobotomy exemplifies this orientation." See if there's anything that I need to clarify on what he said here. So what Szasz is saying is, schizophrenia doesn't actually describe, like, there's not a blood test, there's not a brain scan, there's not any measurable way of saying, oh, look, we can diagnose this person as having schizophrenia. It's an observation, or it's a label. It's a way for psychiatrists to justify what they do through psychiatry. And Szasz is also very clear about it's important to see what psychiatrists do and not just what they say they do, because those are often two very different things. What they say they do has to do with curing mental illnesses, hospitalization, and diagnosing. What they actually do, as Szasz points out in many of his books, has more in common with the jailer or the police officer in coercing, in forcing, in involuntarily incarcerating innocent people. So this book, Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry, teems with fascinating facts about psychiatry, including literary allusions and insights into the history of medicine. Quote, "Throughout the long history of medicine," Szasz observes, "the more uncertain has been the nature of a disease, the more numerous have been the treatments for it." I think that's just such a perceptive statement. Szasz sees schizophrenia as it really is. Quote, Today there is surely no disease for which this is more true than for schizophrenia. There is no agreement on what schizophrenia is, or who really is or is not schizophrenic. And if the phenomenology of schizophrenia is hidden behind opaque windows, its etiology lies buried in utter darkness. None of this prevents physicians and medical scientists from continually discovering cures for it. Again, Szasz is just spot on. The more vague and mysterious the so-called disease or so-called mental illness is, the more psychiatrists come up with supposed cures. So, fortunately, Szasz understands the implications of his own argument. He compares psychiatry to slavery, and he advocates for its abolition. Quote, similarly, if there is not psychiatry, there can be no schizophrenics. In other words, the identity of an individual as a schizophrenic depends on the existence of the social system of institutional psychiatry. Hence, if psychiatry is abolished, schizophrenics disappear. This does not mean that certain kinds of persons who might previously have been schizophrenics or who might like to be schizophrenics also disappear. There assuredly there remain persons who are incompetent or self-absorbed, or who reject their real roles, or who offend others in some other ways. But if there is no psychiatry, none of them can be schizophrenic. To be sure, the abolition of slavery only frees the slave. It does not make him educated, self-sufficient, attractive, employable, or physically healthy. It only sets him free from his masters. Similarly, the abolition of psychiatry would only free the schizophrenic. It would not make him competent, self-sufficient, attractive, employable, or mentally healthy. It would only set him free from his psychiatrist. And then I conclude, if it was a moral imperative to emancipate, that moral imperative is equally applicable to the emancipation of falsely diagnosed psychiatric slaves from psychiatric slave masters. If all men are created equal, and if they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, then life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the rights not only of psychiatric overlords, but of those whom they enslave through their pseudo-scientific and pseudo-religious practice of psychiatry. So that's a little introduction to schizophrenia and the sacred symbol of psychiatry. Maybe I would just emphasize, too, that Szasz has some other books. He has a book called The Theology of Medicine, The Therapeutic State. A lot of books where he shows how psychiatry is this kind of, not just a pseudoscience, but a pseudo-religion, or it's a false religion that mimics true religion. Szasz is an atheist. He doesn't believe in true religion. He doesn't believe in God, apparently. But I think he's right that psychiatry isn't just mimicking science. It's not just a pseudoscience. Psychiatry is also mimicking religion. It's a pseudo-religion. And as part of this religion, like with all religions have symbols. And one of the main symbols of psychiatry is, therefore, schizophrenia. So get rid of this, show how this symbol, this fake disease, is, a false symbol of the false religion of psychiatry. And that's one step in the direction of liberating the captives of psychiatry. But like Szasz says, just liberating a slave or liberating a victim of psychiatry doesn't necessarily mean that that person will then be competent, self-sufficient, and attractive, employable, and healthy. Like, all of those things are going to take healing and effort, and so that's only one step. The abolition of psychiatry is, like the abolition of slavery, was only one step in the process of guaranteeing equality under the law, or the equal dignity of human beings, regardless of race or gender or anything like that. So that's Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry. And in line with that, in the same vein, I'd like to introduce an interview I mentioned earlier. So, if any of you have heard of William Buckley, he is one of America's great conservative intellectuals, founder of National Review Online, famously said that conservatives should stand athwart history, yelling "stop." So in a way, Thomas Szasz is standing athwart history, yelling "stop." He's standing athwart psychiatry, yelling "stop." So here's the video. You can also find this online. I just discovered, so this is called Psychiatry New Explorations. It's an hour long with guests Thomas Stephen Szasz, Richard Vatz, and Lee S. Weinberg. Um, so, so Buckley, and this is a great interview because Buckley was considered to be one of the most brilliant thinkers of his time. Uh, Obviously, very intelligent man and very learned, uh, vast vocabulary. He uses some great words in this interview. I just listened to it. He uses the word condign. He uses, well, and Thomas Szasz too. It's great to see these two great minds going back and forth. And Szasz has some backup with his friends Vatz and Weinberg. Um, but if you can find this interview online, I'll put a link to it underneath. That basically Szasz is teaching William Buckley why there's no such thing as mental illness. And, William Buckley is rightly skeptical, but by the end of the interview, if you're not persuaded that Szasz and his friends are right, or at least that they've made a compelling case, then I would think maybe you're not watching it very carefully. Um, so Buckley had hosted many people over the years, including presidents, statesmen, activists, academics, and writers. And he was renowned for his erudition, his vast vocabulary, and penchant for vigorous debate. Um, so, and Buckley calls Thomas Szasz the bad boy or the Socrates of psychiatry. And he starts by asking questions to Dr. Thomas Szasz that show that reveal a prejudice behind the questions, and throughout the interview, Szasz and his colleagues carefully show William Buckley why the assumptions behind his questions need to be examined. So as Buckley is examining Szasz and his colleagues, Szasz and his colleagues actually end up examining William Buckley. And in my estimation, Szasz and his colleagues effectively defend the assertion that there is no such thing as mental illness. So I highly recommend that video, that interview. And William Buckley brings up a lot of what I think are sort of kind of gotcha questions. He tries to come up with these weird scenarios, and Thomas Szasz just isn't having any of it. He's saying, look, these questions are all have an assumption behind them that needs to be examined, and that one of the major assumptions is that there is such a thing as mental illness, and that it describes some physical biological reality. And as Szasz and his colleagues show, it's just simply not the case. So check out that video. I'll post a link to it, and you can see. I mean, besides reading Szasz's book, you can see Szasz in action, and he's actually a very. Besides being brilliant, he's very personable, very humorous, and just. He might be considered the Socrates of psychiatry, but he's also very witty and down to earth, and just kind of person who just speaks things as he tells the truth as he sees it. So for that reason, I admire Szasz, and I think he actually he did a really excellent job on this interview with William Buckley. So there's a little bit of firing line, William Buckley and Thomas Szasz, and a little bit about schizophrenia and the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry. Speaking of humorous, I just discovered a cartoonist who calls herself anti-psychiatry, um, and she has this great little book called "Of Course I'm Anti-Psychiatry, Aren't You?" An illustrated critique of 21st century psychiatry. So I'm always on the lookout for these people who have also discovered the truth about psychiatry. Um, Anti-psychiatry here just so happens um, discovered, or a lot of her inspiration for her cartoons has come from Robert Whitaker's website, Mad in America. She lists Peter Bregin's Toxic Psychiatry as an influence, Joanna Moncrief's The Myth of the Chemical Cure and the Bitterest Pills, Lucy Johnson's Straight Talk Introduction to Psychiatric Diagnosis, Ethan Waters' Crazy Like Us, that we talked about, The Globalization of the Western Mind. Oh, Philip Hickey. This is the name of the guy that I was thinking of. So Phil Hickey, Dr. Phil Hickey, is from my point of view, is one of the best authors on Mad in America, because he's like Szasz, like Bonnie Burstow. He writes very clearly, concisely, and just tells the truth plainly, and I really really like that. So anti-psychiatry is also influenced by Mad in America, as I said, and Robert Whitaker, The Anatomy of an Epidemic. Um, there's a little biography here. Anti-psychiatry was born into a dairy farming family in Lancashire, England in 1969, the sixth of seven siblings. She graduated from University of Wales, Cardiff in 1990, obtaining a BSc honors in pharmacology, and went on to research the side effects of antipsychotic drugs at Manchester University for a master's degree, graduating in 1992. During this time, she began to question established psychiatric theories and practice. She turned to cartooning in 2015 as a creative outlet for her growing sense of disquiet at the damage being done in the name of psychiatry. Her biggest cartoonist influences are Gary Larson, Dr. Seuss, and Matt Groening. You can find her at www.antipsychiatry.com. Oh, those are good influence. I love Gary Larson. I love reading Gary Larson cartoons when I was younger. And Dr. Seuss is fun, and of course The Simpsons, who can, although my aunt would, often tell us not to watch The Simpsons, I still watched it and thought it was funny. Because it is funny. So maybe I'll just show you a couple of cartoons. Well, here's one that was about schizophrenia. Let's see if I can get it to show good. Well, here. I gotta. There we go. If your only tool is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. Pharma's remedy for schizophrenia has a psychiatrist whacking someone on the head with Zyprexa and Abilify, Haldol, Risperdal, Seroquel. So it's although it's a cartoon, it's actually a very accurate description of what psychiatry does to people. And let's see. This one is interesting. This is a cartoon about the cycle of stigma. So it shows how psychiatry labels human distress as mental illness, which then leads to this stigma. But then it perpetuates a cycle of stigma because it's the anti-stigma campaigns that are actually increasing the stigma, which I think is similar to like a lot of the anti-suicide campaigns, anti-mental illness campaigns, whatever you want to call it, not anti-mental illness, sorry, suicide, anti-suicide, anti-stigma. These very well-meaning people are out there because they want to help people. They want to reduce the stigma. They want to reduce, obviously we don't want people killing themselves, and that's obviously a good thing. People want to help, but a lot what they don't understand oftentimes is that these campaigns are actually increasing the stigmas, increasing the suicides, and having the opposite of their intended effect. Um, which is just how psychiatry works. It drags people into the trap um, by claiming to help them, even well-meaning people. Um, Here's a little cartoon that I like a lot. If you can see it here. Googling psychiatry is a sham, a pseudoscience, not a science, BS, a hoax. And it has a little anteater doing the Google search because it's anti-psychiatry. I just thought that was a brilliant little cartoon. So she's very creative. There's a lot of other good cartoons in here. So yeah, I recommend this little book. Of course, I'm anti-psychiatry, aren't you? Uh, you know, any intelligent, reasonable person who knows anything about the history of psychiatry would oppose it. Just like any intelligent, reasonable person who knows anything about slavery would oppose it, or anything about the Nazis would oppose them. So these are a few resources for learning the truth about psychiatry. And next time, I think we'll talk about this book, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna, Asperger's Children, Edith Scheffer. This is about autism specifically. So we've talked about schizophrenia, how that's the sacred symbol of psychiatry. But all along while I was making these discoveries, it was always in the back of my mind, well, what about autism? Like, there's something doesn't seem right about that. Like, you see all these claims of people, criticizing so-called anti-vaxxers by saying, well, anti-vaxxers think that vaccines cause autism. Well, as if that's... Okay, first of all, there's a lot of evidence to support the conclusion that a lot of people have been harmed by vaccines, and that a lot of things have changed. This is not to say that, the eradication of disease like polio and so forth with vaccines hasn't been a good thing. It's just that there have been changes, and that everything involved with the way that vaccines are done nowadays. There's good reasons to be skeptical, and that you don't have to be an anti-vaxxer to wonder, to have questions. But the other problem is, yes, this is a problem because people who are skeptical of vaccines, or so-called anti-vaxxers, have also unfortunately perpetuated the notion that vaccines cause autism, which is problematic because whatever vaccines do as harm, and whatever it does that looks like autism, the very notion of autism is similar to the other fake diseases that we've seen, schizophrenia and so forth. And as we'll learn in Asperger's Children, the history of it, which isn't to say... And I should conclude by this. Of course I know people. I have friends. I remember one friend telling me about her mother who has schizophrenia. She thought like the CIA was communicating with her through the television, and all these different things. And she was telling me all this stuff about her mom, and I'm just thinking, okay, yeah, well, those are weird. That's definitely weird, but it's not... There's no such thing as schizophrenia, so you might want to learn about what that is. And other friends who have told me about relatives who struggle with the the symptoms that have been diagnosed as schizophrenia, and I just think, as terrible as those symptoms are, and they are, and it's horrible. Even worse is to tag this label on it, call it schizophrenia, and drug the person for the rest of their life. Because as we've seen, these drugs are causing terrible harm, and they're actually sometimes the primary cause, if not one of the causes of the symptoms that are then diagnosed as so-called mental illness. So, and when it also, I have friends who have children who have been diagnosed with autism, and I've talked to them about it, and I've even met some of these kids, and actually, the son of the author of this book was diagnosed with autism, and he has some interesting things to say at the end here. And I just feel bad for these poor kids. I feel bad for the kids diagnosed with ADHD or bipolar or schizophrenia or autism, because they're being labeled and categorized by these fake diseases, and that in turn that influences the way they see themselves, but it also influences the way their parents and others see them and treat them. So whatever their odd behaviors or whatever their mannerisms, or whatever things that people perceive as being different or wrong, is hardly a problem compared to the fake diseases that have been applied to them, and the consequences. And as we'll see in Edith Schaeffer's book, Asperger's Children, the history behind the label autism is so horrible that it's almost unbelievable that these so-called diagnoses have persisted to this day. So we'll talk about that next time, and I will see you soon.